On April 27, 1805, a flag was raised over the fortress walls of the city of Derna, located on the coast of North Africa. It was not the green banner of Islam, nor the standard of the local Pasha. The wind from the Mediterranean Sea unfurled a canvas with 15 stars and 15 stripes. For the first time in the history of the United States of America, its national symbol was hoisted over a captured fortification in the Old World. This moment, frozen in time, became the culmination of one of the most incredible, adventurous, and desperate operations ever undertaken by the military machine of the young state. But behind this triumphant image lay months of inhumane trials, hunger, betrayal, and a march through hell that seemed designed to break any will. To understand how a handful of men ended up thousands of miles from home in the sands of the Libyan desert, one must rewind time and look at the geopolitical map of that era. At the turn of the 19th century, the Mediterranean Sea was far from the calm resort region we know it to be today. It was a zone of constant risk, controlled by the so-called Barbary states, semi-autonomous provinces of the Ottoman Empire located on the northern coast of Africa, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripolitania. The economy of these regions had for centuries been built on a system of maritime raids and extortion, diplomatically referred to as tribute. European powers, possessing powerful fleets, preferred to pay. For the British Empire or France, it was simpler and cheaper to buy off local rulers than to maintain a permanent squadron to escort every merchant ship. This was a cynical calculation. As long as corsairs attacked the ships of weak countries, strong powers gained a trade advantage. But for the young American Republic, which had only recently gained independence and lost the protection of the British fleet, this system became a trap. Merchant ships under the American flag were seized, cargo was confiscated, and sailors were deprived of their freedom, with exorbitant ransoms demanded for them. In 1801, Yusuf Karamanli, the Pasha of Tripoli, decided that the United States was not paying enough. In an act of defiant contempt, he ordered the flagpole in front of the American consulate to be cut down, effectively initiating a conflict. This was a challenge that could not be ignored. President Thomas Jefferson, a longtime opponent of the tribute system, whose position was expressed by the phrase, "millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute," dispatched a naval squadron to the Mediterranean. However, the naval blockade, which lasted several years, proved largely ineffective. Tripoli was perfectly fortified, its harbor protected by reefs and batteries, and the shallow waters prevented heavy American frigates from approaching within effective firing range. The situation reached a stalemate, exacerbated by the loss of the frigate Philadelphia, which ran aground and was captured along with its crew. 307 American sailors became hostages of the Pasha, becoming the main trump card in his hands. It was at this moment of historical inaction that William Eaton entered the scene. A man of complex destiny, a former army officer, a diplomat with an explosive character and inexhaustible energy, he served as consul in Tunis and deeply despised the policy of appeasing local rulers. Eaton was convinced that the only language understood in this region was the language of force, but force applied intelligently. A plan matured in his mind that many in Washington considered madness. He proposed not merely to bombard the city from the sea, but to organize a land operation to change the regime in Tripoli. Eaton's plan was based on exploiting the internal contradictions of the Karamanli dynasty. The ruling Pasha Yusuf had an elder brother Hamid, the legitimate heir to the throne, whom Yusuf had removed and exiled. Eaton reasoned that if Hamid could be found, given support, and a rebellion raised under the banner of legitimate authority, Tripoli could be captured from land. the hostages freed, and a friendly regime established. This was a classic regime change operation, the first in the history of American special services and armed forces, though such terms did not yet exist. Having received a very vague approval from the president and minimal resources, Eaton set off for Egypt, where, according to rumors, the exiled brother was hiding. In November 1804, Eaton arrived in Alexandria. Egypt at that time was itself a boiling cauldron of chaos after the departure of Napoleonic troops and the struggle between Mamluks and Ottomans. Finding a person in this maelstrom seemed an impossible task, but Eaton possessed supernatural persistence. Using connections, bribes, and diplomatic cunning, he managed to locate Hamet Karamanli, who was in deep despair and had practically resigned himself to his fate as an exile. It took all the Americans' eloquence to convince the disgraced prince to risk everything for a ghostly chance to reclaim the throne. Thus began the formation of one of the strangest armies in military history. Eaton had no regular army regiments at his disposal. He had only a handful of money and the authority of a Navy agent. The core of his forces consisted of 8 U.S. Marines under the command of Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon. These were the only professional American military personnel in the expedition. The rest of the __1_ was a motley crew, about 40 European mercenaries, Greeks, Italians, Maltese, as well as several hundred Arab cavalrymen and camel drivers, hired with the promise of pay and future plunder. In total, about 400 people, speaking different languages, professing different religions, and distrusting each other. Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon became the perfect counterweight to the eccentric Eaton. If Eaton was a visionary and a diplomat, O'Bannon was the embodiment of discipline and stoicism. A young officer from Virginia, he understood that his task was not just to command 7 privates, but to serve as the steel backbone upon which this entire shaky structure would rest. He had to lead his men through the desert, where the main enemy was not the Pasha's soldiers, but the sun, thirst, and human weaknesses. The objective of the campaign was the city of Derna, the capital of the eastern province of Tripolitania. To reach it, the detachment had to travel about 500 miles across the Libyan desert from Alexandria to Derna. This route was considered impassable for a large detachment without serious logistical support, which Eaton lacked. On March 8, 1805, the strange procession set off. 50 days lay ahead, which would forever change the understanding of the limits of human endurance. The desert does not forgive mistakes, and after only a few days, the expedition faced harsh reality. Food and water supplies dwindled at an alarming rate. It was here that the technical ingenuity and strict discipline of the Marines, which became the key to survival, manifested themselves. In the absence of spare parts, they repaired weapons with improvised means. Shoes, falling apart from sharp rocks and hot sand, were wrapped in pieces of animal hides cut from fallen livestock. But the most terrible ordeal was thirst. The water in the wineskins became putrid, thick, and foul-smelling, but even that was catastrophically insufficient. O'Bannon introduced the strictest water rationing. Every sip counted. He personally ensured that no one drank more than allowed, understanding that a breach of water discipline would destroy the detachment faster than enemy bullets. This care for his men, combined with uncompromising demandingness, kept the core of the detachment from falling apart, even when the European mercenaries and Arab drivers were ready to turn back. The conflict within the expedition developed on several levels. European Christian mercenaries and Arab Muslims regarded each other with deep suspicion, rooted in centuries of religious wars. The slightest spark, a stolen piece of bread, a sideways glance, could lead to a skirmish. Hamet Karamanli, who was supposed to be a symbol and a leader, proved to be a weak and indecisive man. At the slightest difficulty, he would panic and suggest turning back to the safety of Egypt. Eaton had to use his entire arsenal, from flattery and promises to direct threats, to compel the pretender to the throne to move forward toward his own crown. One of the most critical moments came when the caravan was deep in the desert. Arab sheiks declared a strike, refusing to move further without immediate payment. Eaton, whose treasury was practically empty, refused to pay, understanding that yielding would only provoke new demands. The situation escalated to the limit. 200 armed horsemen surrounded a handful of Christians. Musket barrels pointed at each other. At this moment, the fate of the expedition hung in the balance. O'Bannon lined up his 7 Marines, ready to fight against hundreds. This display of absolute fearlessness and willingness to go to the end produced a powerful psychological effect. The Arabs, who respect strength and resolve, retreated. Eaton, displaying miracles of diplomacy, managed to resolve the conflict by promising a generous reward upon arrival in Derna. The march continued, but the tension did not disappear. In mid-April, when the expedition was on the verge of complete exhaustion, they reached Bamba Bay. This was the rendezvous point where American ships were supposed to meet them. But the horizon was empty. Despair gripped the men. Hamet accused Eaton of lying. It seemed like the end, to be left on the seashore after so much suffering. But the next morning, when the sun dispersed the fog, they saw sails. These were the brig Argus and the schooner Hornet. The sight of the American flag on the masts caused jubilation. It was a moment of transformation. The exhausted, ragged wanderers once again felt like an army. They received food, water, ammunition, and, most importantly, confirmation that they were not forgotten. With renewed strength, the detachment covered the last miles to Derna. On April 25th, the city appeared before them. Derna was well fortified, the garrison numbered about 800 men, and local residents, loyal to Yusuf, were ready to offer resistance. The city's governor, Mustafa Bey, responded tersely and defiantly to the demand for surrender. "My head or yours?" Diplomacy had ended. It was time for weapons. Eaton developed an assault plan that combined the actions of ground forces and naval artillery. This was one of the first examples of a joint operation by the U.S. Army and Navy. On April 27th, the ships approached the harbor and opened hurricane fire on the shore batteries. The stone walls, not designed for modern naval guns, began to crumble. The roar of the cannonade mixed with shouts and the sounds of explosions. Under the cover of smoke and dust, Eaton's detachment went on the attack. The main blow was delivered by mercenaries and Marines. They were opposed by superior enemy forces entrenched behind barricades and in buildings. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Musket fire was so dense that, according to eyewitnesses, bullets knocked gravel from the ground like hail. At some point, the offensive stalled. The mercenaries lay under heavy fire. The situation demanded an unconventional solution, capable of turning the tide of battle not by numbers, but by spirit. Lieutenant O'Bannon, understanding that delay meant defeat, led his men in a bayonet charge. 7 Marines and several dozen Greek mercenaries rushed directly at the enemy fortifications. Here, the most important psychological factor worked. The determination of the tiny group to go on a frontal assault against hundreds of defenders created a force multiplier effect. The enemy simply could not believe that such a small group would dare to storm if there were no hidden reserves or supernatural confidence behind them. The fear of the mad invaders paralyzed the will of the defenders. The line of defense wavered. The attackers burst into the city, sweeping away resistance in close combat. O'Bannon personally led his men, breaking through to the fortress battery. Having seized the guns, they turned them towards the city, supporting the advance of the main forces with fire. It was then, standing on the rampart of the captured battery, that Presley O'Bannon raised the American flag. This was a symbol not just of victory in battle, but of the assertion of a new reality. The fall of Derna was a shock to Yusuf Karamanli in Tripoli. The threat of a further advance on the capital became real. However, as is often the case in history, the military triumph was marred by political compromise. While Eaton was preparing the march on Tripoli, American diplomat Tobias Lear, fearing for the lives of the hostages and not believing in the ultimate success of the ground operation, hastened to conclude a peace treaty with Pasha Yusuf. The United States agreed to pay $60,000 ransom for the prisoners, significantly less than the original demands, but it was still a ransom. The war was over, but for Eaton and Hamet, it was a stab in the back. The promise to restore the throne to the rightful heir was broken for political expediency. Eaton was ordered to evacuate his men and abandon Hamet and his supporters. This betrayal left a bitter aftertaste in Eaton's soul. He returned to America a hero in the eyes of the people, but a deeply disappointed man. He felt that the country's honor had been sold, and the victory, achieved with blood and sweat in the sands, devalued by the ink of diplomats. The fates of the heroes who accomplished the impossible varied, becoming a reflection of two facets of post-war syndrome. William Eaton could not find himself in peaceful life. He was met as a triumphant. Cities arranged banquets. The state of Massachusetts granted him 10,000 acres of land. But the feeling of injustice burned him from within. He became a vocal critic of the Jefferson administration, publicly accusing the government of betraying its allies. This uncompromising stance quickly turned him from a national hero into a political outcast. He lost friends, fell into debt, and, battling inner demons, passed away in obscurity and poverty in 1811. The man who conquered a city on another continent could not conquer a place in the peaceful life of his own country. Lieutenant O'Bannon chose a different path. He left the service soon after returning, but his name remained untainted by political intrigues. He moved to Kentucky, where he became involved in local politics and lived a long, peaceful life, surrounded by the respect of his neighbors. His legacy proved more enduring, embodied not in loud speeches, but in the traditions of the corps he served. The resonance of the events of 1805 is still felt today, extending far beyond the biographies of the participants. The Battle of Derna was the first proof that the young republic was ready to defend its interests globally. It was the birth of the expeditionary tradition of the American Armed Forces. For the Marine Corps, this episode became a formative myth. Part of its DNA, the phrase, quote, "zero," was immortalized in the Marine Corps hymn, which is sung to this day. There is another tangible symbol of this story. Legend has it that Hamet Karamanli, admiring O'Bannon's bravery, presented him with his personal sword before parting, a curved blade with an eagle head hilt, a Mameluke-type sword. In 1825, this design was officially adopted for the officer sabers of the U.S. Marine Corps. And today, every Marine officer wears a weapon at his side that recalls the sands of North Africa and that forgotten friendship, born in battle. The lessons of the First Barbary War remain frighteningly relevant. It demonstrated the complexity of intervening in other regions, the difficulty of regime change, and the eternal dilemma between idealism and pragmatism, between honor and security. The problems Eton faced, unreliable allies, cultural barriers, the need to negotiate with tribes, surprisingly echo the challenges faced by military contingents in the 21st century. History has a way of rhyming, and the Desert of Barca in 1805 posed the same questions that modern strategists must answer. Ultimately, the story of the First Barbary War is not about dates or political treatises. It is a story about the limit of human capabilities, about that moment when the body says, "I can't anymore," and the spirit replies, "You will take one more step." And that step was taken. First one, then another, and so on, 500 miles, all the way to victory, the taste of which was mixed with the bitterness of sand and the sweetness of glory. Forgetting the names of the politicians who signed the treaties, history carefully preserves the memory of those who walked on foot under the scorching sun to raise the star-spangled banner over the walls of Derna.